Hey folks, I'm Wilder. I'm 55, and after decades living out here in the wild, I know firsthand that animals are just as capable of profound love as we are. Today, I'm sharing the true story of Lawrence Anthony and a rogue herd of elephants. He saved them from bullets, earning their trust through sheer compassion. But the most incredible part happened the day Lawrence died of a heart attack. Even though they hadn't visited his house in over a year, and no one could have possibly told them, two herds led by Nana and Frankie walked 12 hours straight through the dense bush. They gathered around his home and stood there, fasting in silent mourning, for 2 full days before quietly returning to the forest. How did they know? That's the beautiful mystery of nature. Where in the world are you listening to this story from? Let me know in the comments below, and please hit subscribe so we can keep sharing these wild journeys together. The sun beat down on the parched earth of Zululand, South Africa, baking the acacia trees under a relentless, cloudless sky. It was the kind of oppressive, suffocating heat where the air itself seemed to shimmer and hum with the desperate drone of cicadas. In the heart of this sweltering wilderness lay Thula, a private game reserve, and the domain of a man named Lawrence Anthony. Lawrence was not your typical conservationist. He was a tall, rugged man in his late 40s, his face weathered and etched with deep lines from years spent beneath the unforgiving African sun. He had eyes that held a quiet, fierce intensity, the eyes of a man who preferred the honest, brutal reality of the bush to the complications of human society. He was stubborn, deeply empathetic, and possessed a reckless kind of courage born from a profound belief that every wild life mattered. Beside him in this wild endeavor was his wife, Françoise. She was a striking contrast to the rugged landscape, a sophisticated, elegant Parisian woman with sharp, observant dark eyes and a graceful posture. Born to the refined streets of France, her personality had shifted over the years, trading high society expectations for the unpredictable, often dangerous reality of the African bush. The brutal demands of the wild had hardened her resilience, transforming her into a woman of quiet, unwavering strength who could handle venomous snakes and emergency crises without a single flinch. It started with a phone call, a call that would change the trajectory of their lives forever. On the other end of the line was Marion, a representative from the Elephant Managers and Owners Association. Her voice was strained, carrying the heavy weight of an impending execution. There was a herd of elephants, she explained, a rogue herd. They were brilliant, destructive, and deeply traumatized. They had broken out of every reserve that had tried to hold them. They were a danger to human life, a liability to property, and the authorities had run out of patience. The verdict was final. They were going to be shot. All of them. Unless Lawrence took them in. Lawrence stood in his office, the heavy warm air pressing against the window. He knew Thula was not ready. The reserve was completely unprepared to house elephants, let alone a herd of highly intelligent, deeply enraged fugitives. They didn't even have a proper boma, a fortified holding enclosure strong enough to contain them. Working alongside Lawrence was David, his reserve manager. David was a pragmatic, sturdy man with a deep, leathery tan and hands calloused from years of mechanical and physical labor. Where Lawrence was the dreamer and the risk-taker, David was the anchor, the man who had to figure out how to build the impossible on a shoestring budget. He was fiercely loyal, but his face paled when Lawrence told him the news. "We can't hold them, Lawrence," David warned, his voice a low, rough rasp of pure anxiety. "We don't have the infrastructure." But Lawrence had already made his choice. You do not turn away a family standing on the edge of a mass grave. He said yes. They had just weeks to build an 8,000-volt electric enclosure, a fortress of wire and timber, designed to hold back the largest land mammals on Earth. They worked day and night, driving posts into the hard, unforgiving earth, stringing the deadly pulsing wire. And then, the massive transport trucks arrived. When the heavy steel doors of the trucks finally groaned open, the air in the boma shifted. It was not just the physical presence of the animals. It was a palpable, radiating wave of sheer terror and rage. Out stepped Nana. Nana was the new matriarch. She was magnificent and terrifying, a towering mountain of gray muscle and scarred hide. Her tusks were long and sweeping, her ears tattered from the brutal realities of survival. But it was her eyes that caught Lawrence. They were ancient, intelligent, and currently burning with an absolute unyielding hatred for humanity. She had every reason to hate. Only days before, her mother, the previous matriarch, and a baby elephant had been shot and killed by humans when the herd had tried to break out of their last reserve. Nana had inherited a broken, grieving family. Beside her stood Frankie, her second in command, a fiercely protective and highly aggressive female who would not hesitate to trample any human who dared take a step too close. Even from a distance, Frankie's posture screamed violence. She kicked up dust, her ears flared wide in a classic threat display, warning the humans that their lives hung by a fragile thread. For a moment, they just stood there, exploring the confines of the boma. 8,000 volts of electricity hummed through the wire between them and freedom. Lawrence stood outside the fence, watching them, hoping that they would calm down, hoping that the trauma would settle. He underestimated them. He underestimated her. Night fell, and the African bush was plunged into a deep, impenetrable darkness. Only the distant roar of a lion and the chirping of crickets broke the silence. But inside the boma, Nana was not sleeping. She was watching. She was thinking. Elephants do not just rely on brute strength. They possess a terrifying, calculating intelligence. Nana walked the perimeter of the fence. She felt the lethal hum of the electricity. She knew she could not push through the wire itself, but her ancient eyes looked up. She saw the heavy wooden posts. She saw the trees surrounding the enclosure. She realized something that no human engineer had considered. The wire carried the pain, but the wood carried the wire. In the dead of night, Nana did not touch the electric cables. Instead, she backed up, lowered her massive head, and slammed her bulk into a large tree growing just inside the boma. The tree groaned, splintered, and crashed downward, falling directly across the high-voltage wires. There was a brilliant, blinding flash of blue sparks, a loud, violent crack of short-circuiting electricity, and then darkness. The power was dead. The hum was gone. Nana had disarmed the fence. With a triumphant, earth-shattering trumpet, she led her family over the downed wires and out into the vast, open wilderness of Thula. Back at the main compound, the sudden loss of power on the boma grid triggered an alarm. Lawrence jolted awake. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. They were out. As he threw on his clothes and sprinted to the door, his two dogs barked frantically at the sudden chaos. Max, a Rhodesian Ridgeback with a graying muzzle and a deep protective chest, sensed the primal danger in the air, his hackles raised. Beside him, Duma, a younger, leaner, and more nervous Ridgeback, paced furiously, letting out sharp, anxious yelps. Lawrence commanded them to stay inside. This was no place for domestic animals. Françoise didn't panic. Her face was a mask of intense focus as she handed Lawrence his two-way radio, knowing exactly the kind of danger her husband was about to drive into. Lawrence sprinted to the Land Rover, shouting for David. David appeared from the darkness, his face tight with a dread they both shared. If the elephants had broken out of the boma, it was only a matter of time before they reached the boundary of the Thula Reserve. And just beyond that boundary were the neighboring farms. The neighbors had been vehemently against Lawrence bringing the rogue herd to the area. They had already promised, legally and unequivocally, that if those elephants set 1 foot under their property, they would be met with hunting rifles. There would be no second chances, no negotiations. It would be an absolute slaughter. Lawrence jammed the keys into the ignition, the Land Rover roaring to life, its headlights slicing through the thick, dusty night. "We have to find them, David," Lawrence said, his grip white-knuckled on the steering wheel. "If they hit the boundary, they are dead." They drove frantically through the treacherous, uneven terrain of the bush. Branches whipped against the windshield, the suspension groaning as they hit deep ruts in the earth. Lawrence's heart hammered against his ribs. How do you find a herd of gray ghosts in the pitch black of an African night? They followed the trail of devastation. Broken branches, massive footprints pressed deep into the soil. The tracks were heading straight north, straight toward the boundary fence, straight toward the guns. Lawrence pushed the Land Rover to its absolute limit, the engine screaming as they tore through the underbrush. He wasn't just driving to save an animal, he was driving to save a family that had already lost too much. He was racing against the dawn, against the neighbors, against the deeply ingrained human instinct to destroy what we cannot control. As the headlights swept across a dense thicket of acacia, a massive gray shape suddenly materialized from the shadows, blocking their path. It was Nana, and she was turning to face them. The massive gray shape of Nana materialized in the headlights of the Land Rover, a prehistoric phantom conjured from the swirling dust of the Zululand bush. She stood directly in their path, her ears flared to their maximum width, her trunk raised and coiled like a massive spring. Behind her, the rest of the herd shifted nervously in the shadows, waiting for her command. Lawrence slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a halt just yards away from the enraged matriarch. The air was thick with the sharp, musky scent of adrenaline and elephant. David sat frozen in the passenger seat, his breath catching in his throat. Beside him was Vusi, one of Thula's senior Zulu rangers. Vusi was a lean, sinewy man in his late 30s, possessing a quiet, unassuming demeanor that masked a profound, almost spiritual understanding of the wild. His face was sharp and angular, and his eyes, usually warm and observant, were currently wide with a healthy, ingrained terror of rogue elephants. Vusi's personality was shaped by generations of ancestors who had lived and died alongside these majestic beasts. He respected them deeply, but he knew better than to trust a grieving matriarch. In a desperate, chaotic blur of revving engines, shouting, and blinding high beams, Lawrence, David, and Vusi managed the impossible. They did not shoot, nor did they retreat. Using the vehicles as loud, metallic predators, they somehow herded the bewildered and exhausted elephants back away from the fatal boundary line and into the confines of the repaired boma. The high-voltage electricity was restored, the hum returning to the wires. But as Lawrence stood outside the enclosure, watching the massive silhouettes pacing angrily behind the cables, a chilling realization washed over him. The 8,000-volt fence was nothing but a temporary illusion. If these highly intelligent creatures wanted to break out again, they would. Steel, wood, and electricity could not contain their trauma or their rage. Lawrence realized that to save them, he didn't need a stronger physical barrier. He needed to build a boundary of the mind. He needed a whispering campaign. The next morning, Lawrence instructed his staff to stay away from the boma. He would face the herd alone. Accompanied only by a camp guard dog named Brutus, Lawrence walked down to the enclosure. Brutus was a massive, thick-necked borbole, about 7 years old, with a coat the color of dried mud and a heavily scarred muzzle from past skirmishes with baboons and feral pigs. Normally, Brutus was a fiercely protective and vocal guardian, practically fearless in the face of intruders. However, the overwhelming presence and scent of the elephants terrified the old dog into silent obedience. He stayed glued to Lawrence's heels, whining softly, his tail tucked firmly between his muscular hind legs. Lawrence sent Brutus back to the safety of the main house. He stepped right up to the boundary of the electric fence, exposing himself completely to the 9 massive animals inside. The blazing African sun beat down upon his shoulders, but a cold sweat prickled the back of his neck. He began to talk. He didn't use commands or shouts. He spoke in a low, rhythmic, conversational tone. He talked about the weather, about the Thula reserve, about the grass they were eating. He realized very quickly that the elephants did not understand a single word he was saying, but they were deeply attuned to his tone, his cadence, and his body language. They were listening to the frequency of his intentions. "This is your home now," Lawrence murmured, keeping his voice steady, his hands resting loosely on his hips to show he held no weapons. "You are safe here. Nobody is going to hurt you anymore. But you cannot leave. If you leave, you will die." The reaction from the herd was immediate and hostile, spearheaded by Frankie. Frankie, the fiercely protective female and Nana's second-in-command, was a terrifying force of nature. While Nana was the calculating mind of the herd, Frankie was its raw, unbridled fury. She hated Lawrence. She hated humans. Every time Lawrence approached the fence, Frankie would launch herself at him. She would charge from the center of the boma, 7 tons of muscle and bone hurtling toward the flimsy wire, stopping only inches before the electric current could bite her. The ground shook violently under Lawrence's boots. Frankie would scream, a deafening, bone-rattling trumpet of pure hatred. When intimidation failed to make the human run, Frankie escalated her tactics. She began hurling projectiles. Ripping up the earth with her massive feet and trunk, she threw heavy clods of dirt, thick branches, and rocks directly at Lawrence. Debris rained down on him, stinging his face and arms. It was a terrifying display of targeted violence. If the electric fence had weakened even slightly, or if Frankie had decided that the shock was worth the kill, Lawrence would have been crushed into the red dust in a matter of seconds. But Lawrence understood the fundamental rule of the wild: predators prey on the weak, and prey runs away. If he ran, he was confirming their belief that humans were untrustworthy enemies. If he flinched, he lost his authority. And so, he anchored his feet into the dirt. As Frankie charged, roaring and throwing rocks, Lawrence forced his body to remain completely still. He did not step back. He lowered his voice, speaking to her with a calm, unwavering rhythm. "I see you, Frankie," he said smoothly, even as a clump of dirt shattered against the fence right in front of his face. "I know you're angry, but I am not moving. I am staying right here." Day after day, from dawn until dusk, Lawrence stood at the fence. He ate his meals there. He drank his coffee there. He became a permanent, non-threatening fixture in their shattered world. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, and the mental toll of standing inches away from certain death began to wear him down. Yet, he persisted, pouring his energy into his voice, projecting empathy, calmness, and an iron will. Weeks blurred into a grueling cycle of heat, dust, and tension. Frankie's charges gradually lost their lethal edge, becoming half-hearted bluffs rather than genuine attempts at murder. The herd stopped pacing the perimeter, looking for an escape, and started grazing closer to where Lawrence stood. The whispering was working. The vibrations of his voice were slowly overriding the traumatic memories of gunshots and shouting men. Then came the morning that changed everything. The air was still and cool, the sun just beginning to paint the horizon in strokes of gold and crimson. Lawrence was leaning against a wooden post outside the wire, talking softly about the impending rain. Nana, who had been watching him intently from the center of the enclosure, slowly separated herself from the herd. She moved with a silent, deliberate grace that belied her massive size. Step by step, she approached the fence until she was standing directly in front of Lawrence. The matriarch and the man looked at each other, separated by a thin wire pulsing with 8,000 volts. Nana did not trumpet. She did not flare her ears. Slowly, gracefully, she lifted her massive trunk and extended it over the top wire of the electric fence. Lawrence stopped speaking. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The trunk hovered just inches from his face. It was not a gesture of mere curiosity. It was a highly complex, ritualistic assessment. The tip of an elephant's trunk is packed with thousands of nerve endings and possesses an olfactory sense far superior to any hound. Nana's trunk moved gently over Lawrence's face, hovering near his mouth to catch his scent, drifting down to his chest. She was reading him. She was smelling the chemical composition of his sweat, feeling the tiny vibrations of his breath, and, most importantly, listening to the rhythm of his heartbeat. She was searching for the telltale spikes of adrenaline that would betray fear, malice, or hostile intent. Lawrence closed his eyes and forced his heart to slow down. He projected every ounce of love, respect, and peace he had in his soul. He offered his life to her in that single, suspended moment. For what felt like an eternity, the trunk lingered. Then, ever so gently, the rough, bristled tip of Nana's trunk brushed against Lawrence's cheek. It was a soft, deliberate caress. The air in the boma shifted. The heavy, suffocating blanket of hatred and terror evaporated, replaced by a profound, silent understanding. Nana withdrew her trunk, let out a low, rumbling sound from deep within her chest, and turned back to her herd. The war was over. Lawrence had not conquered them with force. He had won them over with patience and an unwavering refusal to let them die alone in the dark. The boundary between life and death had been crossed, and on the other side, a fragile but beautiful trust had been born. The fragile trust established at the perimeter of the electric boma marked a monumental victory, but the battle for Thula had only just begun. Nana, Frankie, and the rest of the herd had accepted Lawrence's desperate plea for peace, stepping back from the brink of execution to cautiously explore the vast, thorny expanse of the reserve. However, Winning the elephant's trust was merely the first hurdle. Zululand was an ancient, unforgiving landscape that demanded constant vigilance. It was a place where survival was never guaranteed, and danger lurked not just in the minds of traumatized elephants, but in the very soil, the tall grass, and the shadows of the surrounding communities. The harsh reality of the bush was a daily, visceral presence for Lawrence and his wife, Françoise. Their home, a rustic compound nestled deep within the reserve, was a sanctuary that constantly had to be defended from the wilderness, pressing in on all sides. This daily defense was most intensely felt through their beloved companions, Max and Duma. Max, the 7-year-old Rhodesian Ridgeback, was a heavy-set, deeply loyal dog with a graying muzzle and a chest like a barrel. He was the stoic guardian of the veranda, possessing a calm authority born from years of surviving the bush. Age had slowed his sprint, but it had sharpened his instincts. Duma, on the other hand, was a 2-year-old Ridgeback, a lean, heavily muscled, and highly strung bundle of kinetic energy. Duma had a beautiful, pristine wheaten coat, but possessed a nervous, reactive personality, prone to charging blindly at rustling bushes before assessing the danger. Living in Thula meant Lawrence had to be the ultimate protector of these dogs, whose domestic bravery was no match for the apex predators of Africa. The nights were the most dangerous. A large, solitary male leopard had claimed the territory overlapping the compound. Leopards are the phantoms of the African bush, silent, ruthlessly efficient, and possessing a terrifying fondness for domestic dogs. Lawrence spent countless sleepless nights patrolling the perimeter of the house with a high-powered flashlight, listening to the alarm calls of monkeys and bushbucks that signaled the big cat's invisible approach, desperate to ensure Max and Duma were safely locked indoors. But the threats were not confined to the darkness. One blistering afternoon, the terrifying speed of a black mamba shattered the midday quiet. Reaching over 9 feet in length, the mamba is arguably the most feared snake on the continent, highly aggressive, incredibly fast, and carrying a neurotoxic venom that can kill a human in minutes. The olive-scaled serpent slithered onto the cool concrete of the veranda, its head raised, mouth gaping open to reveal the inky black interior that gave the species its name. Duma, reacting with characteristic youthful recklessness, lunged forward with a furious bark. Lawrence had to throw himself physically into the dog's path, tackling the heavy Ridgeback to the floor just as the mamba struck, its fangs hissing through the empty air where Duma's snout had been a fraction of a second prior. The snake vanished into the undergrowth like a whip crack, leaving Lawrence trembling in the dirt, clutching his dog, a stark reminder of the razor-thin boundary between life and death in Zululand. Nature's fury, however, was not limited to predators and venom. As the dry season tightened its grip, the lush green grasses of the reserve turned into brittle, pale tinder. A single lightning strike, or a carelessly tossed match from a neighboring road, could ignite a catastrophe. When the wildfire finally came, it arrived with the roar of a freight train. Driven by fierce, shifting winds, the wall of flame consumed the dry savanna with terrifying speed, threatening to incinerate centuries-old trees and trap the newly settled wildlife. Lawrence, his manager David, and their team of rangers fought the inferno for 3 grueling days and nights. Covered in soot, their lungs burning from the thick, acrid smoke, they used wet burlap sacks, heavy branches, and controlled backburns to starve the advancing fire. It was an exhausting, brutal physical battle that left Lawrence utterly depleted. Standing amidst the smoldering, blackened earth, leaning heavily on a fire beater, Lawrence looked out at the vast perimeter of Thula. He realized a profound truth. He could not protect this land alone. The reserve could not survive as an isolated fortress of conservation, surrounded by impoverished human settlements. He needed allies. To secure the future of Thula, Lawrence had to navigate a landscape far more complex than the African bush. The intricate, deeply rooted diplomatic terrain of the local Zulu tribes. Just beyond the reserve's borders lived the Mkwanazi tribe, a proud community struggling with the harsh economic realities of rural South Africa. To them, the reserve was often viewed with deep suspicion, a vast tract of land locked away for wild animals, while local families faced poverty and hunger. This resentment bred a dangerous environment, creating a fertile recruiting ground for ruthless, highly organized commercial poaching gangs who slaughtered rhinos and antelope for profit. Lawrence knew that walls and armed patrols would never stop the poachers. He needed the community to view Thula as their own asset. He initiated a formal meeting with the traditional leadership, seeking an audience with Chief Macmillan. The chief was a commanding figure in his late 60s, a man whose physical presence commanded absolute respect. He was tall and broad-shouldered, though slightly stooped by the immense pressure of leading a people caught between ancient traditions and the demands of the modern world. He had a closely cropped cap of white hair and a face line like the deeply textured bark of a leadwood tree. His eyes were dark, calculating, and possessed a quiet, ancient wisdom. The chief was a traditionalist, fiercely protective of his community's heritage, and understandably skeptical of white conservationists who historically prioritized animal welfare over human dignity. The meeting took place in the chief's kraal, under the sprawling shade of an ancient acacia. Lawrence understood that to earn respect, he had to show respect. He did not arrive with legal contracts or arrogant demands. Instead, he arrived with humility, ready to engage in the time-honored Zulu customs. The negotiations were slow, deliberate, and steeped in ritual. A large communal clay pot of uchwala, traditional fermented sorghum beer, was brought forward. It was thick, cloudy, and possessed a strong, sour, earthy taste. To refuse the beer would be a grave insult. When the heavy pot was passed to him, Lawrence took it in both hands, raised it to the chief, and drank deeply, accepting the hospitality and honoring the culture of his hosts. Wiping the foam from his mouth, Lawrence laid out his vision. He proposed a pact of mutual benefit. Thula would not be a walled-off playground for the wealthy. It would be an economic engine for the Mkwanazi tribe. He promised jobs for the local youth as rangers and lodge staff. He pledged that a portion of the meat from necessary ecological culling would be distributed to the villages. Furthermore, he outlined plans to help build local infrastructure and support community tourism ventures. In return, Lawrence asked for one thing: their eyes and ears. He needed the community to stand against the commercial poaching syndicates that were plundering the region's natural heritage. Chief Mkwanazi listened in silence, his deep-set eyes studying Lawrence's face, searching for the deception he had seen in so many outsiders before. But in the tired, soot-stained conservationist sitting before him, the chief saw a man who had fought fires, faced down rogue elephants, and was willing to drink from the communal pot. He saw a man of his word. The chief gave a slow, deliberate nod. The pact was sealed. Almost overnight, the dynamics of Zululand shifted. The commercial poaching gangs, who had long relied on the silence and apathy of the local villages, suddenly found themselves operating in hostile territory. The community, realizing that the survival of the wildlife was directly tied to their own prosperity, became an impenetrable intelligence network. Thula was no longer an isolated island. It had become part of the tribal landscape. Lawrence had secured the borders not with higher fences or more guns, but with the powerful, unyielding bonds of mutual respect and shared survival. The scarred, fire-swept landscapes of Zululand are remarkably resilient, and as the seasonal rains finally arrived, the blackened earth of Thula erupted into a vibrant, brilliant emerald green. The transformation of the land mirrored the profound psychological shift occurring within the rogue elephant herd. The suffocating veil of trauma, anger, and grief that had shrouded Nana and her family upon their arrival was slowly lifting. They were no longer fugitives pacing the perimeter of an electrified prison. They were the undisputed masters of a vast, 5,000-acre sanctuary. They spent their days stripping bark from the towering marula trees, bathing in the muddy shallows of the river, and communicating in low, resonant rumbles that vibrated through the soles of Lawrence's boots. The true measure of their recovery, however, was not just in their relaxed grazing or their playful water fights. It was in the swelling belly of one of the younger females. The herd was pregnant with new life. The anticipation within the herd was palpable, manifesting in a heightened state of alertness and a tightening of their social bonds. Lawrence noticed the shift during his daily patrols. The older females, acting as vigilant midwives and aunties, rarely let the expectant mother out of their sight. Among them was a subadult male named Ndlovu. Ndlovu was a restless, growing teenage bull, his tusks just beginning to show a dangerous sharp curve. He was gangly, carrying an awkward weight as he transitioned from calf to adult, and his personality was marked by a constant testing defiance. He would often charge at warthogs or snap branches aggressively, pushing boundaries just to see what he could get away with. Yet, as the birth approached, even the tempestuous Unlovu fell into a strict, disciplined line, acting as an outer sentry for the matriarchs. When the day finally arrived, it was announced not with a trumpet, but with a profound, sacred silence that settled over the dense acacia thicket. Lawrence, tracking them on foot, sensed the change in the atmosphere. As he carefully parted the heavy foliage, he witnessed a breathtaking display of wild solidarity. The entire herd had formed a tight, impenetrable circle, facing outward like a fortress of gray, wrinkled stone. Their massive heads were lowered, ears flared, creating an absolute barrier against any potential predators, lions, hyenas, or humans. Inside this protective ring, the miracle of the bush was taking place. After hours of patient, respectful waiting at a safe distance, the tight formation finally began to loosen. The massive bodies shifted, parting just enough to reveal the newest resident of Thula. It was a baby boy. They would later name him Mandla, a Zulu word meaning power or strength. Mandla was a tiny comical miniature of his towering relatives. He stood barely 3 feet tall, his skin remarkably pinkish-gray, and covered in a sparse fuzz of coarse reddish-black wire hair that stuck out at odd, erratic angles. His ears seemed entirely too large for his head, flopping wildly with every unsteady step. But his most defining feature was his trunk. Unlike the dexterous, muscular appendages of the adults, Mandla had absolutely no control over his trunk. It swung around his face like a useless, heavy rubber hose, and he frequently stepped on it with his own clumsy, oversized feet, resulting in soft, bewildered squeaks. Despite his wobbly, uncoordinated appearance, Mandla possessed an innate, fiery curiosity and a playful, mischievous personality. He was completely unburdened by the traumatic history of his family. To Mandla, the world was a safe, fascinating playground, and his innocent joy instantly injected a light-hearted, healing energy into the previously somber herd. As Lawrence watched the newborn stumble through the tall grass, a remarkable thing happened. Nana, the fiercely protective matriarch who had once tried to crush Lawrence with thrown boulders, turned her massive head toward him. Instead of signaling a threat display or tightening the defensive ring, she took a few deliberate steps in his direction and let out a soft, welcoming rumble. She then stepped aside, actively creating a gap in the protective circle. It was an unmistakable invitation. Moving with slow, deliberate reverence, Lawrence stepped forward. He walked right up to the edge of the herd, completely exposed, standing within striking distance of a half-dozen fiercely protective wild elephants. He was allowed to look upon the newborn Mandla from just a few yards away. The aunties blew soft clouds of red dust over the baby's wet back to protect his sensitive skin from the sun, completely ignoring the human standing in their midst. In the brutal, unforgiving laws of the African bush, a human being granted access to a newborn wild elephant was practically unheard of. It was the ultimate manifestation of the whispering method, a profound interspecies acknowledgement that Lawrence was no longer an outsider. He was considered part of their extended family. However, as the months passed and Mandla grew stronger, this beautiful, unprecedented trust began to mutate into a dangerous overfamiliarity. The herd, having completely lost their fear of Lawrence and his staff, started to view the main residential compound not as a human boundary, but as an extension of their own grazing territory. It began subtly. They would linger near the driveway, stripping the leaves off the ornamental trees Francoise had planted. Then, they began to use the heavy wooden posts of the perimeter fence as scratching posts, their immense weight groaning against the timber. Lawrence tolerated this, amused by their comfort. But he soon realized he had made a critical error in judgment. In the wild, familiarity breeds danger. If these elephants completely lost their natural caution around human structures, what would happen if they ever wandered beyond the borders of Thula? Not every human they encountered would be Lawrence. A fearless elephant is a dead elephant. The climax of this blurred boundary occurred on a quiet, lazy Sunday afternoon. Lawrence and Francoise were relaxing in the living room of their thatched roof house. The large glass-paneled windows and double doors leading out to the veranda were thrown wide open to catch the afternoon breeze. Francoise was reading a book, her elegant posture relaxed, completely adapted to her wild surroundings. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell across the room, plunging them into darkness. Lawrence looked up, and his blood ran cold. Standing directly on the tiled veranda, their immense bodies blocking out the sun, were Nana and Frankie. They were so close that Lawrence could see the intricate web of cracks on their tusks and the individual stiff hairs on their chins. But they hadn't just come to the porch. Driven by an insatiable curiosity, the two massive females had extended their heavy, muscular trunks straight through the open windows and right into the living room. The tips of their trunks, functioning like giant sensitive fingers, were actively exploring the interior of the house. One trunk swept over the coffee table, sniffing a discarded newspaper and a coffee cup, hovering inches from Francoise's face. The sheer terrifying scale of the animals in the confined space was paralyzing. A mature elephant weighs over 7,000 pounds. If Nana or Frankie decided to step forward, or if they were suddenly spooked by a falling book or a barking dog, they would walk straight through the brick walls of the house, collapsing the heavy thatched roof down upon Lawrence and Francoise in a matter of seconds. The beautiful bond of trust had crossed a lethal line. Lawrence knew he could not be the gentle whisperer in this moment. He had to speak a language they understood implicitly, the language of dominance and territorial boundaries. He had to become the alpha. Lawrence stood up abruptly. He didn't reach for a weapon, but he expanded his chest, making himself appear as large as possible. He locked eyes with the matriarch. "Hey!" Lawrence roared. It was not a shout of panic, but a deep, booming, guttural command that resonated from the bottom of his lungs, mimicking the authoritative bellow of an angry, dominant bull. "Get out! Back!" He marched directly toward the windows, pointing a stern, unwavering finger right at Nana's massive face. He did not stop. He did not hesitate. And he did not show a sliver of fear. "This is my house! Out!" The sudden, aggressive shift in Lawrence's demeanor stunned the elephants. The trunks instantly snapped back out of the living room. Nana's ears flared in surprise, and for a tense, breathless second, she evaluated this challenge. Lawrence held his ground at the window frame, projecting an aura of absolute, unyielding dominance. Slowly, recognizing the undeniable authority in his voice and posture, Nana lowered her head, gave a soft, submissive rumble, and backed away from the veranda. Frankie followed suit, the two giants turning their massive bodies and retreating into the thick brush. Lawrence stood at the window, his heart hammering in his chest, watching the gray shapes disappear into the trees. He had drawn a line in the sand. He loved them deeply, but he had successfully taught them the most crucial law of the jungle. Mutual respect requires boundaries. The house was his territory. The bush was theirs. And for both of their species to survive, that line could never be crossed again. The physical boundaries established on that tense Sunday afternoon at the main house created a necessary, respectful distance between the human inhabitants of Thula and the rogue elephant herd. Nana and her family implicitly understood the new law of the jungle. The brick-and-mortar compound was Lawrence's domain, and the sprawling, untamed wilderness was theirs. Yet, paradoxically, as the physical distance between them solidified, a different, far more profound connection began to bridge the gap. It was a connection that defied the rigid boundaries of conventional science, operating on a wavelength that Lawrence was only just beginning to comprehend. The elephants were communicating, not just with each other, but with him, tapping into a current of invisible frequencies and psychic phenomena that would forever alter his understanding of the natural world. This unseen dialogue first made itself known, not through the ears, but through the bones. During the cool twilight hours, when the African bush settled into a hushed reverence, Lawrence would often venture out in his Land Rover, parking on a ridge overlooking the valleys. He was occasionally joined by visiting experts, one of whom was Dr. Ian Sterling. Ian was a renowned wildlife biologist specializing in animal acoustics. In his late 50s, Ian was a tall, angular man with a neatly trimmed silver beard, wire-rimmed glasses, and a posture forged by decades leaning over academic papers and field microscopes. He was a man of strict empirical data, measuring the world in hertz, decibels, and observable behaviors. His personality was rigid and deeply analytical, inherently skeptical of anything that bordered on the mystical or emotional. He had come to Thula to study the vocalizations of the once rogue herd, equipped with highly sensitive parabolic microphones and recording gear. One evening, as Lawrence and Ian sat in the open vehicle, the silence of the bush was absolute. The human ear could detect nothing but the faint rustle of dry leaves and the distant chirp of a nightjar. Suddenly, Lawrence felt a strange, rhythmic pressure building in the air. It was not a sound, but a physical sensation. A deep, resonant vibration that bypassed his eardrums and settled directly into his sternum. His chest cavity began to hum, a low, thrumming tremor that felt as though a massive, invisible engine was idling just beneath the soil. He looked over at Ian, whose eyes were wide behind his spectacles, staring intently at the digital readouts on his equipment. The needles on the audio meters were spiking wildly, registering a cacophony of noise that neither man could hear. Infrasound, Ian whispered, his analytical mind captivated by the data, though his voice betrayed a rare tremor of awe. He explained that elephants possess the extraordinary ability to generate low-frequency vocalizations, murmurs and rumbles that fall far below the threshold of human hearing. These infrasonic waves are incredibly powerful, capable of traveling through the dense forest canopy and even through the ground itself for miles, allowing the animals to communicate complex messages over vast distances. To Ian, it was a fascinating biological adaptation, a marvel of evolutionary engineering. But to Lawrence, sitting in the fading light with his chest vibrating in time with the unseen herd, it felt like something far deeper. It did not feel like mere biological data transmission. It felt like a language of the soul. He realized that the elephants lived in a perpetual, shared web of consciousness, feeling each other's presence, emotions, and intentions through the very vibrations of the earth. And somehow, incredibly, they had extended that web to include him. The true depth of this invisible, telepathic connection was proven beyond any scientific doubt a few months later. The administrative realities of running a massive wildlife reserve occasionally dragged Lawrence away from the sanctity of the bush. He was scheduled to fly to Johannesburg for a series of grueling meetings with conservation officials and financial backers. Johannesburg was a jarring, concrete metropolis, a world of exhaust fumes, ringing telephones, and relentless human urgency, the absolute antithesis of Thula. On the morning of his departure, Lawrence drove out into the reserve to silently say goodbye to the herd. He didn't find them. This was highly unusual. Usually he could track their general vicinity within an hour. But on this day, the elephants had completely vanished, retreating into the deepest, most inaccessible ravines of the 5,000-acre property. It was as if they knew he was leaving and had preemptively withdrawn their presence, severing the emotional tether before he even packed his bags. Lawrence left for the airport with a heavy heart, the absence of their low-frequency hum leaving a strange, hollow void in his chest. For 4 days, Lawrence navigated the sterile boardrooms and chaotic streets of Johannesburg. He was physically present in the city, but his mind remained tethered to the red dirt of Zululand. Back at Thula, the staff reported that the elephants remained invisible. They did not visit the watering holes near the roads, nor did they graze in the open valleys. They had gone entirely silent, effectively dissolving into the shadows of the forest the moment Lawrence's plane had taken off. By the 5th day, Lawrence had had enough. His meetings were running long, but an intense, inexplicable pull gnawed at his intuition. It was a visceral, overwhelming urge to go home. He abruptly canceled his final afternoon appointments, packed his bags, and headed for the airport, securing a seat on an earlier flight back to the coastal city of Durban. From there, he rented a car for the long, arduous drive north into Zululand. Because his change of plans was entirely spontaneous, he did not call Francoise or the reserve staff to inform them of his early return. In an era before ubiquitous cell phone coverage in the deep bush, there was absolutely no way for anyone, human or animal, to know he was coming back a day ahead of schedule. The drive took hours, the landscape gradually shifting from urban sprawl to the rolling, acacia-studded hills of the wilderness. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange, Lawrence finally turned his vehicle onto the bumpy, unpaved dirt road that led to the main gates of Thula. As he approached the heavy steel gates, the headlights of his car swept across the boundary fence, illuminating a sight that caused him to slam his foot on the brake pedal. Standing in the gathering twilight, lined up parallel to the main gate, was the entire elephant herd. Nana stood at the forefront, her massive silhouette striking against the fading light, flanked by Frankie and the rest of the family. The young calf, Mandla, was peering curiously through the legs of his aunts. They were not grazing. They were not passing through. They were standing entirely still, their trunks resting on the ground, facing the exact direction from which Lawrence was driving. Vusi, the senior ranger who was manning the gatehouse, stepped out into the headlights, his face a portrait of sheer, unadulterated shock. He looked from the elephants to Lawrence's car, shaking his head in disbelief. "They just arrived, Mr. Anthony," Vusi stammered, his voice hushed. 10 minutes ago. They came out of the deep bush, walked straight to the gate, and just waited. We didn't know you were coming. How could they know? Lawrence slowly stepped out of his car, the cool evening air washing over him. He walked toward the closed gate, stopping just a few feet from where Nana stood on the other side. The matriarch let out a long, low rumble that Lawrence felt instantly in his sternum, a vibration of greeting, of relief, of profound recognition. They hadn't heard his car engine. He had been miles away when they began their march to the gate. They hadn't smelled him on the wind. There was no empirical data, no infrasonic wave capable of tracking a spontaneous flight change across hundreds of miles of modern civilization. Dr. Ian Sterling's scientific textbooks could not explain what had just happened, but standing there in the dust, looking into the ancient, intelligent eyes of the matriarch, Lawrence understood. The elephants possessed a heightened psychic intuition, a collective consciousness that transcended the physical boundaries of space and time. They had tuned into his frequency. They had felt the shift in his intentions the moment he decided to return, reading his mind across the vast expanse of the country. He had saved their lives, and in return, they had woven his spirit inextricably into the fabric of their own. From that day forward, Lawrence never doubted the invisible magic of the African bush. He knew that, to the elephants of Thula, he was never truly away. Years flowed over the Zululand bush like the seasonal rains, washing away the bitter scars of the past and nurturing a profound era of peace at Thula. The rogue herd that had arrived in a storm of terror and high-voltage fury was now the thriving, beating heart of the reserve. Nana, the matriarch, had grown older, her massive form carrying the majestic, quiet dignity of a queen who had successfully guided her people through a devastating war into a golden age. Frankie, once the embodiment of unbridled rage, had mellowed into a steadfast, watchful guardian of the growing number of calves. The elephants had not just survived, they had flourished, expanding their family and their territory with a confident, peaceful grace. As the years advanced, Lawrence Anthony found himself stepping back to observe the magnificent society he had helped save. He was older now, the fierce African sun having deepened the lines etched around his intense, empathetic eyes. His physical stamina was beginning to wane under the relentless demands of the wild, but his spirit had never been more illuminated. He spent countless hours parked on dusty ridges, watching the herd interact. To assist him with the mounting administrative and ecological duties, Lawrence had recently taken on a young conservation intern named Dylan. Dylan was a 24-year-old ecology graduate from Cape Town. He was tall, remarkably thin, with a mop of unruly sandy hair and bright, eager eyes full of naive, textbook-driven idealism. His brand-new stiff khaki uniform and pristine leather boots stood in stark contrast to Lawrence's faded, dust-worn attire. Dylan was inherently kind-hearted and driven by a genuine desire to manage nature. But his university education had instilled a clinical, data-driven detachment that Lawrence actively sought to dismantle. Dylan had a habit of viewing the animals strictly through the cold lens of population dynamics, carrying a clipboard everywhere and taking notes on behavioral algorithms. One golden afternoon, Lawrence and Dylan sat in the Land Rover, watching the herd graze peacefully near the riverbank. Max, the once robust Rhodesian Ridgeback, lay curled in the back of the vehicle. Max was now in his twilight years at the age of 12. His previously deep wheaten coat was heavily frosted with white around his scarred muzzle and paws. Though his body was frail and arthritis had stiffened his once powerful gait, his personality remained fiercely loyal, his amber eyes still tracking the shadows of the bush with a quiet, protective vigilance. Dylan was busily logging the feeding rates of the adolescent elephants when Lawrence gently reached over and pushed the young man's clipboard down. "Put the data away for a minute, Dylan," Lawrence said softly, his gaze fixed on Nana, who was gently using her trunk to help a clumsy calf navigate a steep, muddy bank. "Look at them. Truly look at them. What do you see?" Dylan blinked, slightly confused. "I see a stable matriarchal family structure, exhibiting cooperative rearing behavior." Lawrence smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "You see biology. I want you to see their souls. When they came here, they were labeled rogue. They were condemned to death because they were deemed bad animals. But there is no such thing as a bad animal. There are only humans who don't understand them, who push them to the brink of terror and expect them not to fight back." Lawrence pointed to Frankie, who was resting her trunk affectionately over Nana's back. "They taught me the true meaning of family. They taught me about absolute loyalty, about a selflessness that puts the survival of the herd above the survival of the individual. We think we are the pinnacle of emotional intelligence on this planet, but humanity still has so much to learn from the natural world. If you give a wild beast your absolute, uncompromising compassion, they will not just tolerate you, they will reciprocate with a love that defies all logic." Dylan fell silent, watching the gentle giants with a new, unquantifiable perspective. The lesson sank deep into the young man's heart, fundamentally shifting his rigid academic worldview. It was the core of Lawrence's legacy, the belief that the barriers between species were an illusion constructed by human arrogance, and that love was the universal language of the wild. The elephants had learned to respect the boundaries Lawrence had set years ago. They had completely stopped visiting the main residential compound, understanding that the area around the house belonged to Lawrence and Francoise. In fact, by the early months of 2012, it had been over 15 months since a single elephant had stepped foot near the perimeter fence of the main house. They roamed the furthest, deepest reaches of the Thula Reserve, living fully autonomous, wild lives. Lawrence had succeeded so thoroughly that he was no longer needed for their daily survival, but the psychic, invisible tether that bound the man and the matriarchs remained entirely intact. In March 2012, Lawrence traveled to Johannesburg for a conservation conference. The stress of his lifelong crusade to protect the voiceless, combined with the grueling physical toll of the African bush, finally demanded its due. On March 2nd, the world lost a giant. Lawrence Anthony suffered a massive, fatal heart attack. The news sent a shockwave of profound grief through the global conservation community, but nowhere was the devastation felt more deeply than back at Thula. Francoise was left shattered, mourning the sudden loss of her husband, her partner, and the soul of the reserve. There were no cell phones in the deep bush. There were no radio broadcasts that the wildlife could comprehend. No human being went out into the 5,000-acre wilderness to inform the animals that their savior was gone. Yet, in the dense, silent heart of the Zululand forest, something shifted. Miles away from the main compound, Nana and Frankie stopped grazing. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the two herds that now made up the extended family. The invisible frequency, the low rumbling tether of infrasound and psychic connection that had linked them to Lawrence's heartbeat, suddenly snapped. The void left behind was immense and undeniable. Without a sound, Nana turned south. Frankie aligned beside her. The entire extended family of elephants, from the massive bulls to the smallest calves, fell into a deliberate, somber formation. They began to walk. It was not a casual foraging stroll. It was a purposeful, relentless march through the dense thickets and thorny ravines of the African bush. They walked for hours as the sun dipped below the horizon, continuing their trek under the pale light of the moon. They walked with a heavy collective sorrow, driven by a profound intuition that science could neither measure nor explain. 12 hours after they began their journey, the massive gray silhouettes emerged from the tree lines surrounding the main compound. Francoise, exhausted and drowning in her grief, stepped out onto the veranda the next morning, and froze. There, lined up silently along the perimeter fence of the house, were the elephants. More than 20 of them, led by Nana and Frankie, had gathered. They had broken their 15-month absence for one singular, heartbreaking purpose. They had come to say goodbye. There was no aggressive posturing, no attempts to break the fence, no loud trumpeting. The elephants simply stood there, an immovable wall of quiet mourning. Their trunks hung heavy and limp, their ears draped flat against their shoulders in the universal posture of elephantine grief. For 2 entire days, the herds held their vigil. They did not leave to drink from the nearby watering hole. They did not strip the surrounding trees for food. They stood fasting, sacrificing their own physical needs to honor the spirit of the man who had stood before them in the dark, risking his life to offer them a second chance. Françoise stood on the porch, tears streaming down her face, witnessing the most astonishing, pure display of interspecies empathy the world had ever seen. The whisperer was gone, but the love he had poured into the wild had echoed back to his doorstep. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the Zululand sun broke over the horizon and bathed the landscape in a warm, golden light, Nana finally lifted her massive head. She let out one long, low rumble, a sound that vibrated through the earth, through the walls of the house, and into the very depths of Françoise's heart. Slowly, deliberately, the matriarch turned. Frankie and the rest of the family followed. With a silent grace, the majestic giants melted back into the dense, green embrace of the ginseng forest. They returned to the wild, leaving behind a legacy of compassion that would outlive them all, a testament to the unbreakable bond forged when a man chose to listen to the whispers of the earth. The story of Lawrence and his elephants leaves us with a profound truth. Love is the ultimate language of the universe. It does not need words, it only requires a willing heart. In our busy daily lives, we often build walls around ourselves, much like the electric fences at Thula. We get hurt, we get tired, and we shut others out. But what if we chose patience instead of anger? What if we offered a listening ear to someone who is hurting, or simply showed up for a friend in need? The elephants teach us that no act of kindness is ever wasted or forgotten. Sometimes, the most healing thing we can do is just be present for one another, just as Lawrence stood by the fence, and just as the elephant stood by his home. May God bless you and your loved ones with the same fierce, unconditional love that these magnificent creatures showed. May He grant you the patience to understand those around you and the strength to always keep your heart open. If this story touched your soul, please share it with someone who needs a reminder of the good in the world. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing these beautiful journeys together. And if you believe that compassion can heal even the deepest wounds, please type Amen in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.